when we were last together, we were starting into what I think is one of the most fascinating of the whole long book, The Promised Day Has Come, where the Guardian is going through the history of the previous 100 years to show what happened to those kings and rulers who were addressed by Baha'u'llah and the Bab. And I think that one of the aspects of this is, remember, this letter is being written during the early and really awful days of World War I and World War II in 1940, where things are not going well. The Nazis are on the march, the Japanese are on the march, the Italians under Mussolini are on the march. There's some really bad things happening, and it's taking a while for the people, the countries that are going to be pushing back to get their acts together and to start winning the war against fascism. So I think he's trying to really show them how important it is to have heart and to understand that these prophecies of Baha'u'llah are true, and that, you know, what happens after the letters were sent, it didn't happen immediately that all of a sudden the king lost his power, but over the next few years, the forces set in motion by those letters had a tremendous impact. And so I think this is really, to me, what why the letter is so important, to show us the power of Baha'u'llah and the power of these pronouncements to the kings and rulers, and how they really began to change the course of history. So last week we looked at Napoleon III, and we're starting into the Pope. And I think we may have gone a little bit into it, but before we even get into this, I wanted to back up a little bit, because remember when we were going through Napoleon III and Alexander II, the Tsar, he addresses them in his letters in that he understands their true motives for starting the Crimean War. And so this last week, I was finally, after looking in a number of different sources, able to find the incident that I think Baha'u'llah was referring to. None of you have probably been able to go to Bethlehem, to the Church of the Nativity, where, according to tradition, and in fact, Abdul Baha authenticates it, Jesus was born in a lower area of the building that is the huge Church of the Nativity. And so if you go into this lower area below the church, there's sort of actually more of a cave, and they have a spot marked on the floor with sort of a sunburst, a gold sunburst, as to the spot where they believe Jesus was born. In Napoleon III decided that the Christian pilgrims to the Holy Land who were Catholic were not being treated properly. And so he decided to have a special silver cross made, and have a group of friars, Catholic friars, take that cross to that spot and hammer it in over top of the spot where Jesus was born, basically marking that France was going to protect the Catholics coming to the Christian holy places. Well, this was a deliberate affront to Russia, because Russia had always served as the country that was the traditional protector of Orthodox Christians going to the holy places. And if any of you have been to Jerusalem or the other Christian holy places, you will notice that the Orthodox Christians control most of them. Now, so it looked like the Tsar and the Emperor of France were fighting over who's going to control the Holy Land and who's going to protect the pilgrims. But what they were really doing, because remember, the Holy Land at that time was part of the Ottoman Empire, was starting to vie with each other for the imminent carving up of the Ottoman Empire. So Baha'u'llah says, you made your point in going to war. You made it seem that you were going to war to protect Christian pilgrims to the Holy Land, but your real intention was to try to grab territory owned or controlled by the Turks, by the Muslims. And you knew that that empire was tottering, and you saw an opportunity to go in there and do something about that. So he is questioning their motives in those letters. So we will see as we go through tonight that there's a lot of other connections to the Crimean War that were set in motion and affect some of these other rulers, including the Pope. So let's tonight, I think I will do more of the reading, if you don't mind, and talking, because basically this is going to be a history lesson. And I've had to do some boning up in the last few hours and weeks to sort of see what the Guardian is talking about. And frankly, I'm just absolutely flabbergasted. I'm just amazed at Shoghi Effendi's ability to, first of all, to know that history, the history that we'll be talking about tonight, and to understand it at such a deep level and to be able to give it so succinctly. And it's also, of course, another wonderful example of how not only Shoghi Effendi, but Baha'u'llah and Abdul Baha, they allude to people and events without giving them by name. So then you have to go and find out who is it that he's talking about. So let me start with this first slide where he begins talking about Pope Pius IX. I mean, what a name for the Pope that received the letter. This is a name he chose for himself. It's not the name he was born with. It's the name he chose when he was made pontiff. And Pius IX, who would then receive the letter from Baha'u'llah. He was one of the longest serving popes. He became pope in 1848, just a few years into the Bab's ministry. A humiliation less spectacular, referring back to Napoleon III and his stupendous loss at the Battle of Sedan. A humiliation less spectacular, yet historically more significant, awaited Pope Pius IX. So he's saying it's, in that one line, he's giving us a history lesson that the downfall of the papacy, which really accelerated with Pope Pius IX, was more significant than the loss of the last emperor of France. Because Catholicism, the Roman Catholic Church, had a much greater influence on the world than just who was running France. It was to him who regarded himself as the vicar of Christ that Baha'u'llah wrote that the word which the Son, Jesus, concealed is made manifest, that it hath been sent down in the form of the human temple, that the word was himself, and he himself the Father. This here, Baha'u'llah is referring to the opening of the book of John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. So Baha'u'llah is writing in the language of the Gospel of John, that the Word was himself, and he himself the Father. It was to him who stylized himself the servant of the servants of God, that the promised one of all ages, unveiling his station in its plenitude, announced that He who is the Lord of Lords is come, overshadowed with clouds. And if the Pope had really thought about what Baha'u'llah was saying to him, he should have been astounded. It was he who, claiming to be the successor of St. Peter, was reminded by Baha'u'llah that this is the day whereon the rock crieth out and shouteth, saying, Lo, the Father is come, and that which you were promised in the kingdom is fulfilled. Of course, Jesus, when he made him his successor, Peter his successor, said, Shimon, you are the rock, and on this rock I shall found my church. And so he gave him a new name, which was the rock, which translated into Greek was Peter, and then into English. It was he, the wearer of the Triple Crown, who later became the first prisoner of the Vatican, who was commanded by the divine prisoner of Acca to leave his palaces unto such as desire them, and to sell all the embellished ornaments he possessed, and to expend them in the path of God, and to abandon his kingdom unto the kings, and emerge from his habitation with his face set towards the kingdom. I'm going to come back to this sentence because he has packed some big history into one long sentence. And this is Pope Pius IX. And so here's his real name, Count Mastai Ferretti, Bishop of Imola, the 254th Pope since the inception of St. Peter's primacy, who had been elevated to the apostolic throne 2 years after the declaration of the Bab, and the duration of whose pontificate exceeded that of any of his predecessors. So he's the longest serving Pope up until that time. Will be permanently remembered as the author of the bull which declared the Immaculate Conception of the Blessed Virgin, referred to in the Kitab Yagan, to be a doctrine of the Church, and as the promulgator of the new dogma of papal infallibility. Authoritarian by nature, a poor statesman, disinclined to conciliation, determined to preserve his authority, while he succeeded through his assumption of an ultramontane attitude in defining further his position and in reinforcing his spiritual authority, failed in the end to maintain that temporal rule which for many centuries had been exercised by the heads of the Catholic Church. And I'm going to keep going, and then we're going to go back and unpack this. This temporal power had throughout the ages shrunk to insignificant proportions. The decades preceding its extinction were fraught with the gravest vicissitudes. As the sun of Baha'u'llah's revelation was mounting to full meridian splendor, the shadows that beset the dwindling patrimony of St. Peter were correspondingly deepening. The tablet of Baha'u'llah addressed to Pius IX precipitated its extinction. There's not going to be a pope in the future. A hasty glance at the course of his ebbing fortunes during those decades will suffice. Napoleon I had driven the Pope from his estates. The Congress of Vienna had reestablished him as their head and their administration in the hands of the priest. Corruption, disorganization, impotence to ensure internal security, the restoration of the Inquisition had induced an historian to assert no land of Italy, perhaps of Europe, except Turkey, is ruled as is this ecclesiastical state. Rome was a city of ruins, both material and moral. Insurrections led to Austria's intervention. 5 great powers demanded the introduction of far-reaching reforms which the Pope promised but failed to carry out. Austria again reasserted herself and was opposed by France. Both watched each other on the papal estates until 1838, when on their withdrawal, absolutism was again restored. The Pope's temporal power was now denounced by some of his own subjects, heralding its extinction in 1870. Internal complications forced him to flee in the dead of night and in the disguise of a humble priest from Rome, which was declared a republic. It was later restored by the French to its former status. The creation of the Kingdom of Italy, the shifting policy of Napoleon III, the disaster of Sedan, the misdeeds of papal government denounced by Clarendon at the Congress of Paris, terminating the Crimean War as a disgrace to Europe, sealed the fate of the tottering dominion. In 1870, after Baha'u'llah had revealed his epistle to Pius IX, King Victor Emmanuel II went to war with the Papal States, and his troops entered Rome and seized it. On the eve of its seizure, the Pope repaired to the Laterne, and despite his age and with his face bathed in tears, ascended on bended knees the Scala Santa. The following morning, as the cannonade began, he ordered the white flag to be hoisted above the dome of St. Peter. Despoiled, he refused to recognize this creation of revolution, excommunicated the invaders of his states, denounced Victor Emmanuel as the robber king, and as forgetful of every religious principle, despising every right, trampling upon every law. Rome, the eternal city on which rest 25 centuries of glory and over which the popes had ruled an unchallengeable right for 10 centuries, finally became the seat of the new kingdom and the scene of that humiliation which Baha'u'llah had anticipated and which the prisoner of the Vatican had imposed upon himself. And this is Victor Emmanuel. The last days of the old Pope, writes a commentator on his life, were filled with anguish. To his physical infirmities was added the sorrow of beholding all too often the faith outraged in the very heart of Rome, the religious orders despoiled and persecuted, the bishops and priests debarred from exercising their functions. Every effort to retrieve the situation created in 1870 proved fruitless. The Archbishop of Posen went to Versailles to solicit Bismarck's intervention in behalf of the papacy, but was coldly received. Later, a Catholic party was organized in Germany to bring political pressure on the German chancellor. All, however, was in vain. The mighty process already referred to had to pursue inexorably its course. Even now, after the lapse of above half a century, the so-called restoration of temporal sovereignty has but served to throw into greater relief the helplessness of this erstwhile potent prince, at whose name kings trembled and to whose dual sovereignty they willingly submitted. This temporal sovereignty, practically confined to the minuscule city of the Vatican and leaving Rome the undisputed possession of a secular monarchy, has been obtained at the price of unreserved recognition so long withheld of the Kingdom of Italy. So the Treaty of the Laterne, claiming to have resolved once and for all the Roman question, has indeed assured to a secular power in respect of the enclaved city a liberty of action which is fraught with uncertainty and peril. The two souls of the eternal city, a Catholic writer has observed, have been separated from each other only to collide more severely than ever before. All right, let's go back and see if we can make some sense, because you really have to unpack the Guardian with this. The Guardian has, in about 6 paragraphs, tried to cover 200 years of Catholic history. Actually, more than that, because he's going to go back and talk about a pope in the 12th century. I haven't finished with what he has to say about the Pope here, and just reading it. So unpacking it, because he also jumps around with different time periods as he's going through this romp through Catholic and Italian history. It's very interesting the way the Guardian's mind works. So here in this first paragraph about what happened to the Pope, he talks about Baha'u'llah has said to him, I'm the one you're waiting for. I'm the one that Jesus said was coming after himself as the Father, the station of the Father. He was the Lord of Lords has come, overshadowed with the clouds. Again, referring back to the book of John. And the Pope claims to be the spiritual heir of the successor of Christ, St. Peter. He was the wearer of the Triple Crown, which we looked at a picture of that last time we met. But he becomes the first prisoner of the Vatican. And this is not just a term Shoghi Effendi is throwing in there. This is a term that is used by historians and was used by the Pope himself. So let's talk about this. In 756 AD, during the earliest years of the Muhammad dispensation, the church in Rome had started to have secular power as well as spiritual power. It would prove to be its downfall. It had been moving in that direction for some time, and Justinian with the Byzantine Empire was sort of the apex of that. The Pope in Rome began to control what we now refer to as papal states. Essentially, it was the central section of Italy, plus some other areas, where the Pope was essentially a king over those regions of Italy, what we today call Italy, the papal states. And this arrangement went on for more than 1,000 years, from 756 to 1870. Finally, in 1870, Victor Emmanuel's armies, because he was consolidating Italy, as many of you know, and becoming the first king since the Roman period of all of Italy, they finally took the city of Rome, one of the last strongholds of the Pope's power as a king, not as Pope, but as king. And Victor Emmanuel basically said, if you'll consider yourself a citizen of the state of this new country of Italy, you can control this central part of Italy with all the church property, where St. Peter's and the Sistine Chapel and so forth are located. And he said, not on your life. The Pope response was, not doing that. But he knew once he stepped outside of what we now call Vatican City, he was dead meat. He would be immediately under the control of whoever's controlling the city of Rome. So he himself referred to himself as the prisoner of the Vatican. And every pope after him until 1929 continued to be prisoners of the Vatican. Once they became pope, they could not leave the property because they didn't have a good political situation between the Catholic Church and the Italian government.
Would they go by that title? Did they call it? Is that like a title?
They did. Wow. Yes, the popes actually used that title. They called themselves the prisoner of the Vatican. So this, you can go in Wikipedia and you'll see that this is a thing. Shoghi Effendi got it. He understood this at a deep level. So he's saying, here's this man, the Pope that Baha'u'llah writes to, and by the end of his life, in fact, within 2 years after he gets the letter from Baha'u'llah, he himself is a prisoner. He's in a gilded cage, but he's still a prisoner there at the Vatican because he knows he can't leave the property. And he had been told by Baha'u'llah, it was he, the wearer of the Triple Crown, who later became the first prisoner of the Vatican, who it was commanded. The Guardian uses the word commanded by the divine prisoner of Akka to leave his palaces unto such as desire them, to sell all the embellished ornaments he possessed, and to expend them in the path of God, and to abandon his kingdom unto the kings. He could have done it voluntarily, and he was commanded to do it by Baha'u'llah, then he didn't have a choice. He gets to keep his palaces and all those ornaments, but he loses everything else. Abandon his kingdom under the kings and emerge from his habitation with his face set towards the kingdom. Baha'u'llah writes this sentence before the Pope 2 years later becomes a prisoner in the Vatican of his own making, a prisoner of his own making, because he refused to cooperate with the Italian government. So, I mean, this to me is an astonishing sentence on Baha'u'llah's part, really prophesizing or understanding what's about to befall the Pope. So here's what his real name was. He was part of Italian aristocracy before he became a cleric. And he was only 2 years into the Bab's ministry when he became Pope. And I think he lives until 1878. So he had a very long reign as Pope, pontificate, and making him the longest serving of all popes. Think about that. The longest serving of all popes is the one who gets the letter. And he came up with 2 Catholic doctrines, which are still in effect today, although I think they're walking them back a little bit. But the first one is that Mary was always a virgin, not only before Jesus was born, but after she and Joseph were married. And the second, more interesting one, the dogma of papal infallibility, that the Pope could make pronouncements that were infallible in certain types of theological cases. Just as Baha'u'llah is coming and inaugurating institutions that have conferred infallibility, and he himself has infallibility. Now, the interesting thing here is that the Guardian describes him as authoritarian by nature, a poor statesman, disinclined to conciliation, determined to preserve all his authority. In the first couple of years he was Pope, he actually was a reformer. But then he very quickly realized that wasn't going to work for him, and he became very conservative. And he was, as he's well characterized, an authoritarian. He wasn't really reading the times. He didn't understand that, well, what spooked him. So he becomes Pope in 1846. What happens in 1848? All over Europe, there are revolutions, right? This is the year of the revolution. People are taking to the streets, demanding more representation, more democracy, more middle class running of things. And this spooked the aristocracy all over Europe. What's his name or his title before he becomes Pope? He was a count. He's part of the aristocracy. He didn't like that, so he backs off from being a reformer. And his assumption from that point on, he assumed an ultramontane attitude. And I had to look that word up because it's not one we use most of the time, because it means advocating supreme papal authority in matters of faith and discipline. And how Shoghi Effendi came up with that word and knew such a word even existed is another sign of the miraculous aspect of this book. So he became, he really asserted that the papacy had supreme authority in all matters of faith and church discipline. But in the end, he lost, despite this great assertion, he lost what temporal power was left for the church, and which had been exercised by the earlier popes for 1,000 years. And the mismanagement was such that Rome was described during his papacy, when he was running it until 1870, as a city of ruins, both material and moral. Now, more powerful countries in Europe lick their chops when they see another area that's falling apart. And the two countries that saw the Italian peninsula as easy pickings were Austria and France. And for a while, the Pope was he's actually had a mother who was the Pope was actually a great-grandson or great-great-grandson of the Austrian Empress Maria Theresa, the mother of Marie Antoinette. But despite that Austrian royal heritage, he was very much connected politically with France, and France became sort of his protector nation under Napoleon III. So Austria was also, remember, a big part of Italy is the Alps. The northern part of Italy is in the Alps, or the foothills of the Alps. So Austria had intervened in a lot of the northern part of Italy, and they were, the great powers were sick of seeing so many insurrections going on in Italy. It was falling apart. It was a big mess. And so they asked for reforms, and the Pope promised to carry them out, political reforms, and then didn't do anything. So Austria reasserted herself. And then France came to the Pope's aid and say, oh no, we're taking care of him. You stay out of it, Austria. And this went on back and forth. It's much more, the Guardian has taken some very complex back and forth politically and with battles and so forth, and boiled it down to a couple of sentences. His own people were sick of being ruled by the Pope as a king. And finally, he had to flee for a period and go to Sicily. And the reason he went to Sicily was they were actually from Naples south, including the island of Sicily, was essentially a separate country at the time. And so he could get asylum there, but he had to go in disguise to flee for a period after 1870. But 1870, the reason that the Italian army under Victor Emmanuel was able to take Rome, what happened in 1870 that we talked about last week? Napoleon III was defeated by the Prussians. And so he was no longer able to come to the aid of the Pope. So nature abhors a vacuum, and the Italians, trying to unify the country and get Rome back, saw their opportunity. They knew France was too weak at that point in 1870 to come and help the Pope. And so they marched on Rome, and the Pope lost the last bit of ruling authority over anything but the mile square of the Vatican. It says the creation of the Kingdom of Italy, which in many ways is the result of the letter to the Pope by Baha'u'llah. The creation of the Kingdom of Italy, the shifting policy of Napoleon III, the disaster of Sedan. This is where Napoleon III was defeated and had to abdicate. The misdeeds of the papal government denounced by Clarendon. Clarendon is the British Foreign Secretary at the Congress of Paris, terminating the Crimean War as a disgrace to Europe, sealed the fate of that tottering dominion. That tottering dominion is the Papal States. That's it. So this series of things, including, remember, the fall of Napoleon III is also due to Baha'u'llah. So all of this led to the fall of the Pope as a king. Sorry. So I've already gone over what's in this first sentence. About 1870, Victor Emmanuel sees a opening and he goes for it. And in fact, the person who led the army for Victor Emmanuel was Garibaldi, the famous guerrilla warrior, who is sort of he's an icon, not only in Italy, but to many parts of the world. He's a very interesting person. But anyway, he's mentioned briefly in here. On the eve of its seizure, the seizure of Rome, the Pope repaired to the Lateran. The Lateran is the old church, the oldest church of the papacy there in Rome. And despite his age and with his face bathed in tears, ascended on bended knees the Scala Santa. The following morning, as the cannonade began, he ordered the white flag to be hoisted above the dome of St. Peter. Despoiled, he refused to recognize this creation of revolution. So he surrendered. He didn't want a lot of bloodshed. He ordered his troops to at least put up a good fight, but he didn't want it to go on very long. So he put the white flag up to end the fighting, but he refused to accept the state of Israel, the state of Italy, and he excommunicated all of the generals and soldiers who participated in invading the papal states. And he did the same with Victor Emmanuel, the King of Italy. He called him the robber king. So finally, the eternal city became the seat of the new kingdom and the scene of that humiliation which Baha'u'llah had anticipated and which the prisoner of the Vatican had imposed upon himself. Would make a good movie. Here's Victor Emmanuel. So he only lives until 1878. So the last 8 years of his life, he's watching the church just go down and down and down. Everything he did to try to get his power back went nowhere. The mighty process already referred to, which Baha'u'llah's tablet set in motion, had to pursue inexorably its course. And he says that even from his perspective in the 1940, it shows the helplessness of the Pope, at whose name kings trembled and to whose dual sovereignty they willingly submitted. And the only thing the Pope runs now is this tiny city of the Vatican. So then he brings up modern history, modern to him, something that had happened only in 1929, the Treaty of the Lateran. Again, this is that important church in Rome, Catholic Church in Rome, claiming to have resolved once and for all the Roman question. Okay, so the Roman question, which bugged Catholics and Europeans, and particularly Italians, for several centuries. How much power should the Pope have? That's the Roman question. And this is a term used by historians, not just by Shoghi Effendi. So in 1929, the Pope finally signed a treaty with the Italian state. And who was running Italy in 1929?
Mussolini.
And that's right. So he signed a treaty with Mussolini, in which the Pope was given full control over Vatican City and some other papal properties, where his summer palace is and a few other things. And he was, in return, the state of Italy agreed to make the Catholic Church the state religion, the official state religion. In 1984, that was rescinded. So it is no longer the official religion, and other religions were given higher status than they had under the Treaty of Lateran. So that assured to a secular power, the state of Italy, in respect to the enclave city, the Vatican, a liberty of action which is fraught with uncertainty and peril. The two souls of the eternal city, a Catholic writer has observed, have been separated from each other only to collide more severely than ever before. So the secular soul and the spiritual soul were completely separated by all of these events over the last several hundred years. I mean, actually, there's so many other points where the Pope was in trouble and why France is involved. I mean, during the French Revolution, Napoleon marched on Rome and took the Pope from that time in the 1790s, took him as a prisoner and took him back to France. So, I mean, there's all these kinds of things have been going on for a long time. Let's see. Okay, here we go. Well might the sovereign pontiff being Pius IX, recall the reign of the most powerful among his predecessors, Innocent III, who during the 18 years of his pontificate raised and deposed the kings and the emperors, whose interdicts deprived nations of the exercise of Christian worship, at the feet of whose legate the King of England surrendered his crown, and in whose voice the Fourth and Fifth Crusades were both undertaken. So let's unpack that a little bit. This gets into British history as well as others. Pope Innocent was Pope between 1198 and 1216. He was a Pope who claimed to have supremacy over all kings in Europe. He made some major reforms in Western canonical law, which are now seen as significant in the march to constitutional democracy. He started giving interdicts against particular kings. So, for example, there were two cases. An interdict, a papal interdict, was basically a prohibition against something. So, for example, in two cases, he gave interdicts saying that the person that the king married was not lawful because it was a cousin or someone that was too closely related to them by blood for them to marry under the church's teachings. And so basically bringing to an end royal marriages. But what he's referring to here is what Chogi Effendi is referring to is also, by the way, he's the one who organized and sent forth the Fourth Crusade, which ended up sacking Constantinople and bringing to a final end the Byzantine Empire, Innocent III. Obviously, Shoghi Effendi is trying to contrast the power of Innocent III with the power left to Pope Pius IX by the time his papacy ended. But what happened here was King John, that you will remember as the not very wonderful brother of Richard the Lionhearted, for whom we now remember as the king forced to sign the Magna Carta, limiting the king's power for the first time. That same King John got in a dispute with Pope Innocent over who had the right to appoint the Archbishop of Canterbury in England. And it's all complicated, but in the process of trying to work that out, King John really made the Pope angry. So the Pope closed all of the churches in England, wouldn't allow any Catholics to be buried in consecrated cemeteries, wouldn't allow any giving of the sacraments to anybody, any Catholic in England, until King John came around. Needless to say, this caused some real headaches for King John. There was essentially virtually a war going on back and forth between the king and the Pope. And then the king, who was also clever, decided maybe he should do an about face. So then he sent his representative to the Pope and said, oh, I'll repent and do whatever you want. And then you will side with me against all these other people who are now against me. So, anyway, the whole thing turned into a huge mess. It had more to do with politics and power than it did to do with Christianity. But this is the same King John who, as a result of all of these processes set in motion because of his dispute with the Pope, ends up signing the Magna Carta, one of the great documents of history. So then Shoghi Effendi asked, might not the process to which reference has already been made manifest in the course of its operation during the tumultuous years in store for mankind, and in this same domain, a commotion still more devastating than it has yet produced? What are your thoughts about that sentence? Let me read that sentence again, because now he's looking to the future in the year 1940. Might not the process to which reference has already been made manifest in the course of its operation during the tumultuous years in store for mankind, and in this same domain, including the religious world, a commotion still more devastating than it has yet produced? What do you think he means with that sentence?
I want to take a wild guess.
Shaheen? What's your wild?
So it probably has something to do with okay, so these things happen because the Pope didn't heed the answer to Baha'u'llah, right?
Right.
Okay, so we still have other groups that haven't heeded the answer. The Middle East, for example, the Muslims,
Right.
So there's there's still World War I and World War II that have to happen. There's still the collapse of Islam that has to happen, the total collapse, right?
Right.
There's and you know, like even right now we have things going on in Israel and Arab Spring and this and that. So all these things are just still happening, that are happening during Baha'u'llah's lifetime. These are the things that have been set in motion, but they're not the culmination yet. I think just the Baha'i history shows what the rest of it is. I don't know. That's just my guess, but
That I would think that you're on the right track, in my personal opinion. But it says might not, that's a commotion still more devastating than it has yet produced. So as bad as things were for the Catholic Church, for all these kings and rulers, this process is going to do even more devastation than what we've seen so far.
I know that this was written during World War II, and I'm not, too knowledgeable about World War II history, but I think maybe he was predicting something that happened within the time of World War II. And if it was not more devastating to these, people, then maybe he's referring to something that's going to come in the future, which was already mentioned.
is this specific to still the Catholicism, or is this other things that's going to count too? Actually, maybe I should ask that first before trying to take a guess.
Well, I think if you look at all of the what we call mainline churches, the both Protestant and Catholic Church, they're really a shadow of their former selves in terms of the influence that they have. They still have considerable influence, but the Pope, very few kings or rulers shudder when the Pope gives a pronouncement. In fact, most Catholics go, oh, okay, that's interesting. Next, please. Sorry, I've got a thunderstorm going on here. I think that also one of the interesting things, Mr. Grossman, Hartmut Grossman, used to talk a lot about how when his father was on pilgrimage, Hand of the Cause Grossman, that Shoghi Effendi kept telling him that there were only going to be a few more popes and then the papacy was coming to an end. And so the last years of his life, I know Hartmut, every time there was a change in popes, he would wonder, is this the last one? Is this the last one? Is this the last one? And if you look at, there was one place here where he said, leave it, let's see. Let's see where he uses the word extinction. That's what I was. Shoghi Effendi uses it.
I've also heard that one of the popes will rise up against the Baha'i faith.
Yeah, and that would be the beginning, that would be the end of the Catholic Church. The tablet of Baha'u'llah addressed to Pope Pius IX precipitated its extinction. The patrimony of St. Peter. So the extinction of the patrimony of St. Peter is underway. According to in my reading, Shoghi Effendi. So now he's sort of summarizing, because last week we talked about the extinction of the Third Empire and Napoleonic dynasty in 1870 when Napoleon III is defeated, the Battle of Sedan, the dramatic collapse of both the Third Empire and the Napoleonic dynasty, the virtual extinction of the temporal sovereignty of the Supreme Pontiff in the lifetime of Baha'u'llah, were but the precursors of still greater catastrophes that may be said to have marked the ministry of Abdu'l-Baha. The forces, so now he's going to get into the results of World War I at the end of Abdul Baha's ministry, the last years of his ministry. The forces unleashed by a conflict, the full significance of which still remains unfathomed, and which may be considered as a prelude to this, the most devastating of all worlds, he's talking about World War II, can well be regarded as the occasion of these dreadful catastrophes. The progress of the War of 1914 to 1918 dethroned the House of Romanov, while its termination precipitated the downfall of both the Habsburg and Hohenzollern dynasties. So that's the Prussian, German, and the Austro-Hungarian, as well as the Russian. So it's very interesting. The forces unleashed by a conflict, the full significance of which still remains unfathomed. It's only been since in the last 30 years that World War I has begun to be fully appreciated for the changes that it wrought and its true significance. And so this is written many decades before historians started going back and looking at, because World War I was so stupid. I mean, there was no good reason why that war started, which is why historians are so fascinated by this treaty went into effect and this cable happened and this decision was made, the domino effect that set it in motion, because there was no good reason for it. And it was senseless in the way it was fought, the trench warfare and everything. But it really completely remade the world. And in many ways, the fall of the Soviet Union in 1979, in the early 1980s, unleashed all the forces that had been sort of kept on ice at the end of World War I. So it's very interesting. There's now a much greater appreciation of that. And the Guardian saw it already in his lifetime. Okay. So now he's going to get into that and talk about first the rise of Bolshevism. So again, he's referring back in this first sentence to World War I, that inconclusive struggle. The rise of Bolshevism, born amidst the fires of that inconclusive struggle, shook the throne of the czars and overthrew it. So we know during the First World War is when the czar was executed. The inconclusive struggle, we have to remember that Germany was not defeated on the battlefield. It thought it could get some good terms with the promulgation of Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. And so it was tired of fighting. France and England were tired of fighting, but it was never defeated on the battlefield. So it was an inconclusive struggle. And there were a lot of people at the time who debated whether they should bring the war to an end just when the parties were willing, or whether they needed to absolutely defeat one of the parties so that they wouldn't rise up again. So he's now going to talk about the rise of communism. Alexander II Nikolaevich, whom Baha'u'llah had commanded in his tablet to arise and summon the nations unto God, and who had been thrice warned, beware lest thy desire deter thee from turning towards the face of thy Lord. Beware lest thou barter away this sublime station. Beware lest thy sovereignty withhold thee from him who is the supreme sovereign, was not indeed the last of the czars to rule his country, but rather the inaugurator of a retrogressive policy, which in the end proved fatal to both himself and his dynasty. So Alexander II, when he first became czar, was the one to free the serfs. So he looked like a great reformer. I mean, they were one of the last countries to abolish what in essence was slavery. medieval form of slavery that was found throughout most of Europe with the freeing of the serfs. And he also allowed a certain amount of political reforms, but he didn't go far enough, and then he sort of backed off on it. And his grandson would be a disaster. In the latter part of his reign, he initiated a reactionary policy. So he went against his reforming policies that he did as a younger man, which, causing widespread disillusionment, gave rise to nihilism, which, as it spread, ushered in a period of terrorism of unexampled violence, leading in its turn to several attempts on his life and culminating in his assassination. Stern repression guided the policy of his successor, Alexander II, who assumed an attitude of defiant hostility to innovators and liberals. So he sort of, often what happens in history is that you find that during a period of reform, people get their hopes up. And then when the ruler doesn't follow through or sort of goes backwards, it's actually worse. I mean, the period of the French Revolution is a good example, because Louis the 16th was actually more liberal than his predecessors. So expectations had gone up. And this rise of nihilism, I looked it up, and there was a whole movement, a nihilistic movement in Russia during Alexander II's period. And didn't feel satisfied with the materials just on the internet to really understand it. It would be interesting to see the history of Russia during that period to see what the Guardian is talking about.
I have a question. I've heard someone said that this Tsar Alexander II was one of the people who accepted the message of Baha'u'llah. Is that incorrect? Because here we're basically, that is who it was addressed to, right? I haven't actually read the tablet to Tsar Alexander II, but this is basically saying that, this reactionary policy gave rise to nihilism, ended with, his assassination, and then moves on to talk about Alexander III. But is that incorrect?
Well, I think, I wrote to Mujan Momin, and I don't remember whether all of you were here a couple of sessions ago, because Katya had asked the question of how do we know how these letters were delivered, and how do we know what the reactions were? And he explained how we knew the reaction to Napoleon III. But he didn't know the answer to that. And so we don't really know how they reacted. I suspect that in most of these cases, they never even bothered to read it. Somebody put it in a drawer somewhere or filed it away. Apparently, most of the letters, he is speculating, Mujan Momin is speculating that because they used local French officials in the Holy Land to dispatch the letter to make sure it actually got there, they obviously couldn't put it in the mail, that they must have used the same approach with these other letters. But we don't know. We simply, at the moment, I mean, if anybody outside of Iran has access to information and has researched these things, it's probably Mujan. So, at some point, hopefully the archives of these countries will open up. The only one I've ever heard of who answered favorably was Queen Victoria. And he didn't know how we got that information either. So, this is, is interesting. We don't know. It is interesting that Alexander II had a granddaughter who married a minor German prince, and we know her as Queen Marie of Romania. So he married, his daughter married this prince, and anyway.
It wasn't the I might have misunderstood, but I thought it was like, maybe the timing is wrong, the history, but wasn't it?
She's Queen Victoria's granddaughter and the Tsar's granddaughter. So two of the people who wrote,
Oh,
she's the granddaughter of four of her four grandparents. Two of them were monarchs who received letters.
so interesting.
Yeah,
And do you know if Queen Marie was aware of this fact?
I think she was. She
Wow.
was, yeah, I think she was. Yeah. Have to look at the book on her, but I'm pretty sure she was. So here's some pictures of the assassination, sorry, of the Tsar, Alexander II, who received the tablet. So even when you had a slightly more enlightened, better educated monarchs like Alexander II, there's the fact he did backsliding. Well, by the time it got to his grandson, Nicholas II, who would be the last of the czars, the one we know was executed with his family in that basement during the war. The tradition of unqualified absolutism of extreme religious orthodoxy was maintained by the still more severe Nicholas II, the last of the czars, who, guided by the counsels of a man who was the very incarnation of a narrow-minded, stiff-necked despotism, he's talking about Rasputin, I'm sure, and aided by a corrupt bureaucracy, and humiliated by the disastrous effects of a foreign war, that's their entry into World War I, increased the general discontent of the masses, both intellectuals and peasants. So the forces set in motion by his grandfather just snowballed during Nicholas II's time as the Tsar. Driven for a time into subterranean channels, in other words, this discontent had to go underground because the Tsar was trying to ferret it out and go after those who were trying to overturn his rule, and intensified by military reverses. It exploded at last in the midst of the Great War in the form of a revolution, which, in the principles it challenged, the institutions it subverted, and the havoc it wrought, has scarcely a parallel in modern history. So there, in half a sentence, he has summarized the Russian Revolution. A revolution which, in the principles it challenged, the institutions it subverted, and the havoc it wrought, has scarcely a parallel in modern history. There you have it, the Russian Revolution, summarized by Shoghi Effendi. And of course, here he is, the spitting image of his first cousin, the King of England. And of course, here we have Vladimir Lenin, who was sent there by Germany, famously in that train, to take over the revolution that was already underway and to get Russia out of the war. Okay, let's see. All right. A great trembling seized and rocked the foundations of that country, being Russia. The light of religion was dimmed. Of course, they established state atheism. Ecclesiastical institutions of every denomination were swept away, including the Baha'i House of Worship in Ashgabat. The state religion was disendowed, persecuted, and abolished, the Greek Russian Orthodox Church. A far-flung empire was dismembered. A militant, triumphant proletariat exiled the intellectuals and plundered and massacred the nobility. Civil war and disease decimated a population already in the throes of a mighty dominion. Together with his consort and his family and his dynasty, were swept into the vortex of this great convulsion and perished. So this last sentence, finally, the chief magistrate, that's the Tsar, along with his wife, that's his consort, the queen, and the Tsarina, and his daughters and son, and his dynasty were swept into the vortex of this great convulsion and perished. The very ordeal, excuse me, yeah. Mhm.
Do you want to, should we go over this before we go back to the previous?
Sure, sure.
I was just going to say that you mentioned the Ishkabad Baha'i Temple,
Mhm.
and wasn't that the result of an earthquake? But I also remember there was violence against that Baha'i community at some point. Is that what you were referring to?
Yes, because long before they had to tear it down because of the earthquake damage, it was appropriated by the government. And a number of the leading Baha'is in Ishkabad were sent to Siberia. So that community was persecuted. And in the beginning, under communism, they took it over, but allowed the Baha'is to use the building if they paid rent. And then they didn't allow them to use it at all, and they turned it into a library. And then the earthquake came and they had to tear it down. But the Baha'is that had not already fled back into, many of them fled back into Iran or other places. A number of them were persecuted and sent into exile in Siberia.
And were those Baha'is, like, were they sent there for like labor? Like, were they sent to gulags, or were they just driven there, just driven out of their homes and sent there to stay?
I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that the whole history of what happened to Baha'is who got caught in the Soviet Union during the long period of communism is something that there's a lot of heroic stories in there, but they haven't been allowed to be told.
Thank you.
Yeah. And in fact, one of the things that's happened in recent years is as soon as the Soviet Union, as communism fell in Russia, a lot of religious groups rushed in, including us. And the Russian Orthodox Church was like, no, we've been waiting 70, some 80, 100 years to regain our power. We're not going to let the Southern Baptists come in and take our people. And so, there's now this backlash going on in Russia against the outside religious groups. The very ordeal that heaped such dire misfortunes on the empire of the Tsars brought about in its concluding stages. This is the very ordeal is World War I, that heaped such dire misfortunes on the empire of the Tsars brought about in its concluding stages the fall of the almighty German Kaiser, as well as that of the inheritor of the once famed Holy Roman Empire. It shattered the whole fabric of imperial Germany, which arose out of the disaster that engulfed the Napoleonic dynasty and dealt the dual monarchy its death blow. So let's unpack that sentence, or two sentences. So the fall, at the end of World War I, there would no longer be a Kaiser, one king for all of Germany. But as he brings up in the second sentence, Germany had always been a region full of principalities. And it was only in 1870, after the Prussian king, Wilhelm I, defeated Napoleon III, that with the help of Bismarck, they were able to finally bring all of these principalities together to create what we now know as the modern state of Germany. The modern state of Germany is a very new thing. And that was came into existence through that war with Napoleon. That helped to create that. And the dual monarchy is referring to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Remember, the Austrians are another part of the German-speaking people, and there were very close ties historically and ethnically between the Austrians and the Germans. So both of these, which were very intertwined and allies during the war, will be, these dual monarchies will receive their death blow because of World War I. Almost a century before, Baha'u'llah, who had predicted in clear and resounding terms the ignominious fall of the successor of the great Napoleon, that's the ignominious fall of Napoleon III, had in the Kitab-i-Aqdas addressed to Kaiser Wilhelm I, the newly acclaimed victor, a no less significant warning, and prophesied in its apostrophe to the banks of the Rhine in words equally unambiguous, the morning that would afflict the capital of the newly federated empire. And here's what it looked like, what Berlin looked like before World War I. Quite a grand place, right? Do you remember Baha'u'llah thus addressed him, the one Napoleon whose power transcended thy power and whose station excelled thy station? And this is interesting that he keeps referring to Napoleon as having this great power among all the kings of Europe. It's because Napoleon had absolute power, which Queen Victoria did not have, even though she had a bigger empire. So do thou remember the one whose power transcended thy power and whose station excelled thy station? Germany never had a big empire to the degree that France did. Think deeply, O king, concerning him and concerning them who like unto thee have conquered cities and ruled over men. And again, O banks of the Rhine, we have seen you covered with gore, inasmuch as the swords of retribution were drawn against you, and you shall have another turn. And we hear the lamentations of Berlin, though she be today in conspicuous glory. On him who in his old age sustained 2 attempts upon his life by the advocates of the rising tide of socialism, on his son Frederick III, whose 3 months' reign was overshadowed by mortal disease, and finally on his grandson William II, the self-willed and overweening monarch and wrecker of his own empire. On these fell in varying degrees the full weight of the responsibilities consequent to these dire pronouncements. So, the one who received Kaiser Wilhelm I, the first king of Germany, the first king of the whole country. He was the king of Prussia, who became the first king of Germany. He had attempts on his life all throughout his life, but during the last years of his life, the people who shot at him were socialists. His son, who was a reformer, a very enlightened ruler, who was married to Queen Victoria's favorite and oldest daughter, only lived 3 months after he became king and left then, of course, the German Empire to little Willie. So let's talk about the granddad first. Here he is, William I, the first German emperor, 7th king of Prussia, whose entire lifetime had up to the date of his ascension been spent in the army, was a militaristic, autocratic ruler. He was the second son. He wasn't expected to be the king of Prussia. So he had been from a young age put into the military. He was a war hero, and his whole life was spent thinking about the military. Friends, I'm looking at the time, and I know it's now a little bit past their normal stopping time, but if we can go about another 5 to 10 minutes, I think we can finish this section up. Is that okay? Everyone okay with that? All right.
Yeah.
All right. So, like I said, our beloved guardian, he had his finger on the pulse of these people and very succinctly and accurately summarizes them. So he was the first king of Germany, whose entire life had been military in the army. So he was, of course, militaristic. He was autocratic, imbued with antiquated ideas, who initiated with the aid of a statesman rightly regarded as one of the geniuses of his century. We're talking Otto von Bismarck. You've all heard of Otto von Bismarck, I hope. A policy which might be said to have inaugurated a new era, not only for Prussia, but for the world. So Bismarck wanted to unite all of the German principalities. He was also, in good Prussian believed in not only nationalism, but militarism, and he was also conservative. This policy was pursued with characteristic thoroughness. These are good Germans. They do things carefully and systematically, and perfected through the repressive measures that were taken to safeguard and uphold it, through the wars that were waged for its realization and the political combinations that were frequently formed to exalt and consolidate it. Combinations that were fraught with such dreadful consequences to the European continent. This is the rise of the nationalistic, modern, militaristic German state. William II, the grandson, who was born in Windsor Palace Castle in the presence of his grandmother, Queen Victoria. And also, by the way, his birth was difficult, and he ended up having what we would refer to as a withered arm. It was attributed to the way the delivery. And this had a great influence on his character, the fact that his arm wasn't right. William II, temperamentally dictatorial, politically inexperienced, militarily aggressive, religiously insincere. Wouldn't want to be called that by Shoghi Effendi. Posed as the apostle of European peace, yet actually insisted on the mailed fist and the shining armor. Irresponsible, indiscreet, inordinately ambitious. His first act was to dismiss that sagacious statesman, Bismarck, which, by the way, his dad would have done had he lived, the true founder of his empire, to whose sagacity Baha'u'llah had paid tribute, and to the unwisdom of whose imperial and ungrateful master Abdu'l-Baha had testified. So he helped Bismarck put this dynasty on the throne, and this is how they treated him.
I'm sorry, is master referring to a person of like one of his advisors, or is master like some kind of noun referring to maybe his policy?
Okay, let's see here. Okay, irresponsible, indiscreet, and inordinately ambitious. His first act was to dismiss that sagacious statesman, Bismarck, the true founder of his empire, the German Empire, to whose sagacity Baha'u'llah had paid tribute, and to the unwisdom of whose imperial and ungrateful master, that's William II, Abdu'l-Baha had testified. So Abdu'l-Baha himself called William II ungrateful and unwise. So Shoghi Effendi's on firm ground here in his assessment. And here is little Willie. Let's see. Now it's interesting, the Kaiser, the Tsar, and the King of England during World War I were all first cousins, and they all looked alike or looked similar. Toward the end of World War I, a revolution broke out in Germany. William II, deserting his armies, fled ignominiously to Holland, followed by the Crown Prince. The princes of the German states abdicated. A period of chaos ensued. The communist flag was hoisted in the capital, which became a cauldron of confusion and civil strife. The Kaiser signed his abdication. The Constitution of Weimar established the Republic, bringing the tremendous structure so elaborately reared through a policy of blood and iron crashing to the ground. All the efforts to that end, which through internal legislation and foreign wars had ever since the accession of William I to the Prussian throne been assiduously exerted, came to naught. Granddad's handiwork, poof, the end of World War I. The lamentations of Berlin, tortured by the terms of a treaty monstrous in its severity, were raised, contrasting with the hilarious shouts of victory that rang half a century before in the Hall of Mirrors of the Palace of Versailles. What he's talking about in that last sentence. At the end of the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, the Kaiser Wilhelm I was crowned Kaiser in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles on a date that corresponded with a significant Prussian history date, further showing the utter defeat and capitulation of Napoleon III. So when Germany is humiliated through this terrible treaty, and again in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles, it was not lost on either the Germans or the French and English that the treaty was being signed where the Prussians had basically gloated over defeating France in 1870 through the coronation there in that same location.
It's interesting to me that I guess the Guardian here is kind of defining what what Baha'u'llah what he meant by the Lamentations of Berlin, where it says in the Kitab al-Aqdas, banks of the Rhine, we have seen you covered with gore, and you shall have another turn. This Lamentations of Berlin comes after that. But I think what we're talking about here, I looked up like Weimar Republic, it was in 1918. So we're talking about like 1918, around that time. But the other turn, we shall have another turn, doesn't happen until, I guess, World War II, or maybe, maybe it's something.
It's World War II, the end of World War II, when Berlin's basically destroyed, it's divided into sectors, and it's run by the four powers. What city wanted to go through, would ever want to experience what Berlin did after the end of World War II?
That's fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. The Guardian is just, he opens up this history, and I wish I had the time right now to pursue further reading about these things, because he really, like I said, he's got his fingers on the pulse. We're almost at the end, friends. The Habsburg monarch, now he's going to Austria-Hungary. The Habsburgs had been running Europe for centuries, 5 centuries. The heir of centuries of glorious history. And the Habsburgs also for a time ran Spain. They had lots of places on the continent of Europe where they had monarchs. Simultaneously toppled from his throne. Okay, now we're going to talk about Francis Joseph, whom Baha'u'llah chided in the Kitab-i-Aqdas for having failed in his duty. We have been with thee at all times and found thee his duty to investigate his cause, let alone to seek his presence when so easily accessible to him in the course of his visit to the Holy Land. Thou passed him by. Remember, he made a religious pilgrimage to Jerusalem and didn't inquire about Baha'u'llah. He thus reproves the pilgrim emperor, and inquired not about clinging unto the branch and heedless of the root. Open thine eyes that thou mayest behold this glorious vision and recognize him whom thou invokest in the daytime and in the night season. and gaze on the light that shineth above this luminous horizon. And here we have Franz Joseph. He ruled between 1848 and 1916, one of the longest reigns in history of any monarch, whether it's Austro-Hungarian or other countries. The House of Habsburg, in which the imperial title had remained practically hereditary for almost 5 centuries, was, ever since those words were uttered, being increasingly menaced by the forces of internal disintegration, and was sowing the seeds of an external conflict, to both of which it ultimately succumbed. Francis Joseph, Emperor of Austria, King of Hungary, a reactionary ruler, reestablished old abuses, ignored the rights of nationalities, and restored that bureaucratic centralization that proved in the end so injurious to his empire. Repeated tragedies darkened his reign. His brother Maximilian was shot in Mexico. The Crown Prince Rudolph perished in a dishonorable affair. The Empress was assassinated in Geneva. Archduke Francis Ferdinand and his wife were murdered in Sarajevo, kindling a war in the midst of which the emperor himself died, closing a reign which is unsurpassed by any other reign and the disasters it brought to the nation. He had a long time to screw up, and he did. He was ruling a whole variety of ethnicities and nationalities in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. We'll see the map in a minute. And rather than allowing these nationalities to start exerting themselves, he instead repressed them. And his brother Maximilian tried to take over Mexico, got shot there. His son, who was supposed to succeed him, went off to a hunting lodge with a 14-year-old girlfriend, and they had a suicide pact. His wife was assassinated. Now, his wife was the Princess Diana of her day. She's called Sissy, and her statues and her image is on chocolates and all kinds of things all over. I kept wondering, would Princess Diana's cult ever die out? And now going to Austria and seeing that the Sissy's cult of his wife is still very much alive and well in Austria. I think Diana's going to be on coffee mugs 100 years from now. So anyway, he's lost his son in as I said, dishonorable affair with an underage woman. You can hardly even call her a woman. His wife's assassinated. His nephew and his wife are assassinated in Sarajevo, which of course sets World War I in motion, kindling a war in the midst of which the emperor himself dies of old age. But he didn't know how to, he was not a man of his time. So it's just 2 more paragraphs. So the Guardian then talks about the end of the Holy Roman Empire, which was the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Belated efforts have been made to steady his tottering throne. So when he dies in 1916, the war is still going on, and his great nephew, Charles, either Charles I or Charles IV, depending on which country, part of the empire you're talking about, succeeds him. Ironically, he was the emperor they needed. He was an enlightened, very religious person who, even in the short period he was emperor, tried to make some reforms and started trying to bring Austria out of the war and bring, at least to the degree he could, bring World War I to an end. Ironically, his grandnephew, the last of the emperors of Austria-Hungary, has been named a saint by the Catholic Church. So this is that belated efforts had been made to steady his tottering throne. That is the Austro-Hungarian, that's the nephew, great nephew. The ramshackle empire, a medley of states, races, and languages, was, however, relentlessly and rapidly disintegrating. The political and economic situation was desperate. The defeat of Austria and Hungary in that same war sounded its death knell and brought its dismemberment. Hungary sundered its connection. The conglomerate realm was carved up, and all that was left of the once formidable Holy Roman Empire was a shrunken republic that led a miserable existence until, in more recent times, it was, unlike its sister nation, completely extinguished and wiped off the political map of Europe. I think he's talking about the German Nazi taking over the Austria. So at that point, Austria had basically been extinguished and was no longer a separate political entity in 1940. Such was the fate of the Napoleonic, the Romanov, the Hohenzollern, and the Habsburg empires, whose rulers, together with the sovereign occupant of the papal throne, were individually addressed by the pen of the Most High, and who were respectively chastised, forewarned, condemned, rebuked, and admonished. And here's a map showing these former empires. And you can see that the Holy Roman Empire, which had Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, part of Romania, parts of what are today Switzerland and northern Italy, and parts of Slovenia and so forth. These were all part of that. Serbia. And we can see that Turkey is much smaller today than it was before World War I. All right, dear friends, so a romp through history led by Shogun. Huh?
Thank you so much. This was so much great historical context that I was, reading through, I've read, on my own to the rise of Bolshevism section, and, the one or two sections before that and that one. And I guess I haven't really covered the parts that we got to today on my own, but this was really great context. So thank you so much. And thank you for going over time. I know it's really late there.
It would be fun. I would love to do a lot more reading because, every sentence in here, he just packs so much information. It just blows me away that Shoghi Effendi was able to do that.
You mentioned that there was supplementary content that we could go over. I would be happy to do that too. That would be very relevant and great too.
Some other people have, I think, come up with some study guides and things like that. But, today I was looking, we have a number of books. I was reading Winston Churchill's section on Innocent III and King John, and looking at some, some Wikipedia things, but I think some Baha'is have been trying to put some supplementary information, but I was trying to do it on my own today. But yeah, there's so much depth there, and it just blows me away, Shoghi Effendi's knowledge of history. What to him was modern history. So anyway, all right, dear friends, I hope I will see some of you in person this weekend. I know I will see Mateen a couple of times this week, and looking forward to his mom's cooking. So
yeah, we'll see Kathy on Thursday, and then hopefully anyone else can join us on Friday for her talk.
Santa Monica Baha'i Center, what time?
7 o'clock, doors open. 7:30 we start.
Okay, and it's going to be on the new book on Horace Holly.
Yep.
Will it be recorded?
I will try to find out. I think I can get it recorded. Yeah. But once I do, I'll get Surush's help to put it on YouTube.
Great.
Don't need my help. Thank you so much, Kathy.
All right, y'all have a great
Take
weekend.
care.
I hope to see you next week. We'll have to figure out how we're going to manage that one because I'll still be in LA on Monday, but we'll hopefully be able to do it. So,
Sounds good.
okay.
Thank you and good
All right,
night.
thank you. Good night.
Take care, Kathy. Bye. Good night, everyone.